This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Netflix. From the co-director of Shrek and the visionary behind Toy Story comes Spellbound, a magical new animated adventure starring Rachel Zegler, John Lithgow, Jennifer Lewis, Nathan Lane, and Titus Burgess with Javier Bardem and Nicole Kidman. When a powerful spell turns her parents into monsters, Princess Elian must journey into the wild to reverse the curse before it's too late. Watch Spellbound, only on Netflix November 22nd.
The new sheriff in town is the old sheriff in town. Yes, you know the news by now. Donald Trump won election on last Tuesday. But 312 electoral college votes. He basically took all the swing states that weren't even as close as we thought they were going to be. We can break this down multiple ways to figure out what happened. I guess one of the big questions is, what does all of this mean to Canada? Hello, welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. Joining me today to examine this is someone who's not only a columnist at National Post and elsewhere, but someone who has a deep understanding of American history. John Robson is not only a columnist, but also an academic with a PhD in American history, and he's just also an all-around good guy. John, good to talk to you again.
A pleasure to be here.
So, your initial take on this, I know that you have stated many times you're not a fan of Donald Trump. Neither am I, but he's president. We have to take him where he is and deal with him where he is. Your thoughts on how the election went in his way when 4 years ago the man was basically driven out of Washington. Now he's ridden back in on a brilliant white steed of victory. What do you think?
It's a very interesting reaction because I remember my feeling on election night was very much the same as my feeling back in 2016, because I've always said that Trump was unfit to be president, and I still think so. But when I realized he was winning in 2016, I realized that I was elated. And the same thing happened to me again in 2024. Despite my deep misgivings about his character and his ability to do the job, it is such a necessary rebuke to the forces of wokeness and to a Democratic Party that has gotten so out of touch with the American people as to become a real ideological danger to the Western world. There's an old line from Whittaker Chambers. So he was talking about the 1940s and 1950s, and he said that the American working class is Democratic, the middle class is Republican, and the upper class is communist. Well, to some extent, there's something still true about that. But now the Democrats represent the upper class, not the working class. And you see this in the very strong swing toward Trump among young voters, among Latinos. I mean, again, men more than women. An astounding statistic that you mentioned to me right before the program, that 64% of Native American, Aboriginal American males voted for Trump. That ought to be a real wake-up call to anybody who thinks identity politics isn't, among other things, repulsive to normal people.
But Trump took the majority of white males, Hispanic males, American Indian males, as they identify in the States, and he didn't win the majority of black males, but he did increase his popularity. In fact, he increased pretty much all demographic groups in all areas. Whereas Kamala Harris went down, that it was an astonishing loss for her. I had assumed that Trump would win, and I had said before the election, if he wins small, it'll be 287 electoral college votes. If he wins big, it'll be 312. I didn't see him going above that. He landed right at 312. So I wasn't shocked about that, but I was shocked that he won the popular vote. I was shocked that how well he did among Hispanic males. When I was down south a month ago, I was looking at local coverage. I was looking at local polls in Arizona, and in a state with a large Hispanic population, depending on the poll, he was getting 40 to 47% of a demographic that you would normally be told, no, absolutely votes Democrat. They did not this time.
Yes, and I've seen, county by county maps of California, which, of course, if California these days did not go Democrat, they wouldn't win a single state. And yet you can see that more of the counties are going red. He did quite well in New York, which, again, has been a lost cause for the Republicans for a number of elections now.
44% of the vote in New York State. And there were boroughs where he got 35 to 40%.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And I also was thinking, because remember, there was a time when the Republicans dominated the presidency without controlling Congress. From the first Richard Nixon election to George Bush Sr.'s victory, the Republicans won 5 out of 6 elections, and 4 of them by landslides, 400 or more electoral college votes. They lost one squeaker and won one squeaker. But after Bush Sr. broke his no new taxes pledge, the Republicans didn't get 300 electoral college votes again until Trump. And Trump has not put back together the Reagan approach to government. It's quite a different kind of coalition. And in some ways, I think from a policy point of view, it's more troubling. But it obviously resonates with people. And this is where, again, the Democrats need to ask themselves not just what was wrong with the messenger. I mean, I was seeing some news stories saying, Democrats blame Biden. It's like, for heaven's sakes, take some responsibility, including that you knew. Many top Democrats knew that Biden was no longer mentally capable of doing the job, and they didn't tell us. But Kamala Harris, why did they anoint this person? She ran for the nomination 4 years ago and did terribly because voters didn't like her. And then instead of having an open convention, they just they anointed her and said, she's the savior. Look, Black woman. And also Asian woman, right? She checks all the identity politics boxes, but she could barely put together a coherent sentence. And this should have concerned them. I mean, take Barack Obama, please. I wasn't a big fan of Barack Obama, but if you were to get Barack Obama without a script, he made sense. He articulated ideas. He reasoned from premises to conclusions. On the other hand, and the Democrats never really came to terms with this, after 2 terms of Obama's hope and change, the voters were so mad they elected Donald Trump. That should tell you something about your approach to governing that isn't just about ephemera. It's about something rotten at the core of it. And maybe now, finally, they're going to realize if Trump is as bad as we said he was, and if not, we're a bunch of raving lunatics, there must be something really wrong with us if we're worse in the eyes of a lot of people. So in some sense, a cathartic election.
It's kind of the message that I gave to conservatives in this country who just kept saying how awful Justin Trudeau was and how stupid he is and people hate him. And I said, well, if he's that bad, you've lost 3 elections. What are you going to do to figure out why and how you can turn things around? I mean, they appear to have done that with Pierre Poilievre, and voters have moved on from Justin Trudeau. But I think that's good advice to the Democrats. You've lost to this guy twice now. You came very close to losing to him in 2020, and there's all kinds of questions about how that election went down. But obviously, a portion of the country has issues that they want dealt with, and they see him as the guy who can deal with them, especially on working class and middle class Americans dealing with the economy. You mentioned states or counties in California. One of the ones that went Republican, at least it was last time I checked, was Riverside County. Riverside County. That stretches from Orange County, LA border in the west, all the way to the Arizona border in the east, and takes up places like Coachella Valley, famous for its concerts and celebrities, and Palm Springs. I'm telling you, it wasn't the rich folks in Palm Springs or Palm Desert who put Trump over the edge. Some of them may have voted for Trump. It was the working class people, the barber who lives in Indio and has to commute to work, the tradespeople. It was them that voted for Trump and turned Riverside County, a place the Democrats should control. They turned it red.
And when I was trying to get behind the initial things, though significant things like that, I think Trump won first-time voters by 10%. And that's the kind of thing that makes an election pivotal, because people frequently continue to vote the way they first voted. Back in 1980, Ronald Reagan's strongest support was among people who first voted for Herbert Hoover. And my mind went back to something Charles Murray said. It must be 30 years ago now, that chattering classes have built a world that is enormously complicated. The rules in America used to be simple. Most of them were good. A few of them were terrible. But, work hard and you get ahead, that kind of thing. Now, this sort of symbolic landscape detached from daily realities. It is enormously difficult to navigate the legal landscape, the social landscape, the rules of political correctness. And so a lot of people like Trump, I think, in part because Trump, although, again, I'm not downplaying the fact that he is vulgar, offensive, has a feeble grasp of policy, and is petulant narcissist, because he is. Now, all of this does need to be said. But Trump, it looks like he sympathizes with people for whom the modern world is not working because the clevers have rigged the game. And so, again, my old friend David Frum, well, I don't know if he'd consider me a friend at this point, my old acquaintance David Frum spent 8 years sneering about how much better he and his cohorts are than MAGA people, which has only helped elect Donald Trump. But people like David and people like you and I can navigate this world in ways that a lot of people can't. We may not like it, and it may not always turn out well, but the Democrats have to understand that they have built a world that is unfriendly to normal people. And if they want to try and make normal people abnormal, fine, carry on, but you're going to wind up with Donald Trump in the White House. But otherwise, they've got to come back to their whole sensibility is off track. Again, they thought the big gender issue was abortion, but the big gender issue, I think, was transgender, and particularly men in women's change rooms and on men playing against women in sports. That's hugely unfair, and everybody can see that the guy who's 6'3" outweighs the women on the court by 50 pounds, towers over them, and there are many injuries resulting. That this isn't fair. And it's obviously not fair. And the Democrats clever their way around it. And people say, you're all nuts. And they've got to get away from being the nuts party, or they're going to keep losing elections, even to candidates as bad as Donald Trump.
Here in Canada, you keep hearing that anything related to gender is controversial. And that, people that say men, biological males, shouldn't be playing in women's sports, that is somehow controversial, or it's wrong, or that allowing children to change their pronouns and their genders at school without informing mom and dad, well, that's controversial. Not when you talk to average people, and poll after poll shows that. Danielle Smith in Alberta came out with a policy, and she said, look, I'm not saying that no transgendered women in women's sports, but we have to look at it, and maybe that means that if it's a physical sport, maybe there's a weight or a height class or something. But using examples like you did, a big 6'3", 250-pound person against a small woman is unfair. Well, she put that forward, and the public in Alberta said, "Thank you." But the rest of the media and the chattering classes denounce it as outrageous.
Yeah, and she put it forward so timidly too. I mean, again, Pierre Poilievre is kind of playing Trudeau's game and doing it well, but he's not what you'd call a kind of Reagan principled conservative. And I think if they were to be bolder on this, they would do better. We could say we could have a special category for transgender competitors. There was a piece in a British paper about a golfer who had transitioned male to female and then said, I'm going to stop playing professionally. It's not fair. He said, I'd be up there on the tee and I would actually deliberately hold back on my drives because I could just hit the ball so much further that it wasn't a fair contest. And I think most people's sense of fair play recognizes that we should be tolerant of people and we should accommodate. A free society has room for those who are don't fit the standard template, but it also does have to uphold these simple rules of fairness and decency and protection from harm. And the Democrats have gotten away from that in the U.S. And I think that the whole Canadian political class, they don't understand how far they are from the sensibilities of the common people. And of course, one of the problems we've had, and the Americans have had it too, with this rampages on campus and so on, the anti-Semitism, virulent, violent, flagrant anti-Semitism has gotten loose, and it came in through the woke portal. And if you can't understand that when that's the sort of thing you let loose in the world, there's something really wrong with your approach. It isn't a tactical issue. Again, it's a philosophical problem with your worldview. Then you're going to wind up pushing voters in directions that fill you with horror. I mean, again, I don't want to pick on David Trump too much, but for 8 years, he has been totally unable to understand how anybody could vote for Donald Trump. And I remember after the 2016 election, some liberal writer had said, after looking at this result, I realized that I really needed to talk to some of my friends who are Trump supporters to understand their point of view. And then I realized I had no friends who were Trump supporters, that I was living in a bubble. And most people like that writer still lived in a bubble for another 8 years. It's not a matter of saying, yes, you should vote for Donald Trump, but it's a matter of understanding why somebody might do it without being either evil or moronic. And they've got to come around to that because the world is changing. The left was running the table, as Andrew Coyne put it, on every issue, especially in Canada, for decades. But I think that them days is done because people are fed up, and they're rightly fed up.
When I looked at Harris's campaign, I saw one that I felt was leaning too heavy on issues that weren't core. They were core to Democrats, which means they were core to her base. But one of my sayings I'm fond of using is that politics is about addition, not subtraction. And if you're not adding to your coalition, you're not going to win. And so she leaned heavy on abortion and democracy, that Donald Trump was a threat to democracy. If those are your motivating issues, you were already backing Kamala Harris. But when it came to the economy, which everyday Americans felt was not working for them, the Democrats just leaned back and said, well, the GDP is great. Okay, I can't eat GDP, but I do have to pay for groceries that are much more expensive than they were 4 years ago. She just had no answer on the economy. And of course, given her position as border czar, she obviously had no answer on immigration.
Yes, and on the economy, I think one of the mistakes the Democrats made was to say, oh, well, look, inflation is coming down and there's GDP growth. These very short-term numbers look positive. They didn't understand, again, Murray's point, that the people who think the economy is not working for them feel that the whole system is one from which they are excluded more or less on purpose. And again, some of it's the identity politics. If you're a white male, you're told you're an evil colonial oppressor. 300 years ago, you ripped everybody off, and now we're going to put the boots in. And many of these guys are saying, well, I'm not 300 years old, and I'm also not the president of a bank. I'm somebody who's struggling to make a living. But the Democrats, they never connected with the notion that ordinary people feel that the last 30 or 40 years have been bad times for ordinary people, that the economy has gotten away from them. And if you have, 2 university degrees and talk loudly at cocktail parties, you're probably doing fine. But if you work with your hands, if you actually make things, if you're the person that somebody calls when their plumbing busts, you're going to get laughed at. You're going to have job insecurity. Your community is falling apart, and they sneer at you for it. They're not even sympathetic. Even when the remedies were wrong, I always think for the New Deal, I think was a very bad idea. But everybody thought Roosevelt was on their side. He thought he understood them. His fireside chats, people couldn't get enough of them.
Bill Clinton. People felt that Bill Clinton was on their side and understood him. He was successful. It's not that the Democrats can't do it. They've obviously, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, they have held the White House. Harris was just unable to, and I'm not sure who else could have. Perhaps a Gavin Newsom, but the entire political class in North America has for too long been of this idea that, well, we're in a knowledge economy now, so we don't need those people who work with their hands and make things. Some politicians have figured it out. Trump has been their champion, and so they feel like finally someone hasn't forgotten who I am.
Yeah, and doesn't regard me with unbridled contempt, that they would only let me into their house to fix the toilet because they'd absolutely have to, and then they'd spray some sort of essential oil as soon as I was done. And I have to mention, the Daily Show did this spoof thing on the People Behind the People. It was Kamala Harris's holistic thought advisor. And it is side-splittingly funny. And it's also, I mean, as G.K. Chesterton said, the opposite of funny isn't serious. It's not funny. And the Democrats needed to watch that and understand why somebody might think this was a devastating send-up of their approach. It's one of the Robbie Burns thing about the gift to see ourselves as others see us. If you can understand why people might dislike you, if you can see what people might object to about you, and some of the MAGA crowd has trouble with that too, but the Democrats have got to be able to say, without losing faith that they're basically right, to say, why might people think we're wrong? What are we doing that isn't just the fault of somebody else? And I also, you talk about the political class. If you think the last 3 elections, the best people the Democrats have been able to come up with, and remember, this is a party with hundreds of congresspersons, thousands of state legislators, dozens of state governors. The best 3 people they could come up with were Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris. And the Republicans, the best 3 people they could come up with were Donald Trump, and Donald Trump. And here in Canada, what have we got? We've got Elizabeth May, the Greens can't get rid of. Jagmeet Singh leading the NDP. Hopeless case. We've got Justin Trudeau. And Pierre Poilievre maybe is better, but he's not exactly Winston Churchill. And yet they don't understand that the people have good reason to be disgusted with the quality of the choices they're being offered.
You mentioned being able to laugh at yourself. It was interesting to see comedians taking on Harris in ways that I didn't expect, including Saturday Night Live portraying her as someone walking around drunk with a glass of wine in her hand all the time. Because sometimes you'd listen to her speak and, it's not just the now we can be unburdened from what has been. She'd give answers on puffball interviews with Oprah. And you're staring at the screen and saying, what is she talking about? Is she drunk? Is she high? This makes no sense.
Yes, and you're tempted to say, well, that it was gutter politics to suggest a substance abuse problem, but we know the Democrats knew Biden was senile and they didn't tell us. And so if Kamala Harris did have a drinking problem, they would not have dealt with it. They would have lied about it. And again, the breach of faith, it's like with the whole thing about COVID and this draconian overreaction and the insistence that the science was settled on the vaccines. And then when it's time to do a postmortem and look into this, they won't do it. And this is the kind of thing that sows distrust, inclines them toward conspiracy theories, and then points in the direction of Donald Trump. And again, I don't think that Trump is healthy for democracy, but he's healthier than the alternative. So that's why I'm pleased with the result, even though I'm also afraid of it, because it may shake up the elites and have them think to themselves, maybe if we talked less about evidence-based decision-making and did a bit more of it, maybe if we had a little bit of humility, maybe if we were more honest, because again, we haven't even touched on the Hunter Biden laptop thing, but there's another case where the elite institutions knew something they didn't want the voters to know, and they deliberately hid it. And they would, if it had been Trump's kid, it would have been all over the front pages. And that doesn't, excuse Trump his failings, but it does help explain why people think the system is rigged, that it looks after its own. It's like the things you see in Canada all the time, the president of the CBC and won't say if she'll take get a bonus and all this kind of stuff. And the system just looks after its own. And ordinary voters understand it's us against them, and they despise us and they're ripping us off, and they don't feel any sense of guilt. They think they're practically a master race. And when you govern like that, you create a populist backlash, and it can be ugly. But if you don't want that, stop it before it gets out of control.
We need to take a quick break, John, but when we come back, let's talk about billionaires, the impact of money on the race, and to get down to what I said off the top. Let's get down to what this means for Canada, because there's a few things making me scared, and it's not so much Donald Trump. It has to do with how Justin Trudeau will react. More in moments.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
A lot of discussion about the impact of money in politics. Of course, you've got the political action committees. This election, you also had high-profile billionaires, Mark Cuban, out stumping for Kamala Harris, and, of course, Elon Musk, owner of X, stumping for Trump. But here's an interesting thought, John. Most of the billionaires were backing Harris, and she raised more money. This is from an X post that Elon Musk put out. Worth noting that far more billionaires backed Harris than Trump, and she raised almost 50% more money. Here's the details. Harris had the backing. So Forbes counted 83 billionaires backing Vice President Kamala Harris, 52 backing Donald Trump. But as Musk pointed out, she raised 50% more money. Spent incredibly amounts of more money. In fact, in Pennsylvania, she outspent Trump, vastly outspent him, 81 million to about 18 million in Michigan, 55 million to Trump's 29 million in Georgia, 49 million to his 15 million in Wisconsin. And the results are still in his favor. What are your thoughts on Musk and Cuban and the big money people getting involved?
That's a lot of billionaires. I don't know very many billionaires, unfortunately. But I think that the thing that really stands out to me about this, it's another example of this notion of the system being rigged, in that for decades we've been told that money in politics is bad. And why is it bad? Because right-wingers have it, and with it they can buy the brains of the hapless sheep who vote. And so in Canada, we have restrictions on campaign finance and so on. And I've always disliked those. Stephen Harper hated them until he became prime minister, and then he kept them.
In fairness to Harper, the Supreme Court had ruled that they had to stay.
Phooey. He could have done something about it, and he didn't. Stephen Harper is a great missed opportunity in this country. But when the Democrats outspend the Republicans, it's not just that it didn't work. So it proves that all that yapping about money in politics was just another excuse for not connecting with the common people. But it's okay when it's Democrats, but it's terrible when it's Republicans. And this is an example of these complex kind of rigged setup where if Donald Trump had outspent Kamala Harris, there'd be endless cries to restrict spending, almost whether he'd won or lost. But when she outspends him, it's like, yeah, whatever, man. But again, also the fact that so many of these billionaires, like, God bless America that it has so many billionaires, if only we did too. But that this is more proof that the upper class is communist, right? All these people who've done so well in America's free enterprise system and then shown ingratitude on a massive scale. The elite is far to the left. I keep, I don't know what to call it. I would say I X'd out, right? But I keep Xing out. The revolt of the elites continues, because this is one of the strange things happening to Western civilization right now, is that it is not a revolution from below. It's this populist uprising, a counter-revolution from below, trying to get back to normalcy. The revolution's coming from above. And the real crazies are the people at the top. The people who most hate Western civilization are those who've received the greatest benefits from it. And Justin Trudeau is a case in point. Who has been handed more on a silver platter by Western society than him? And who hates Western society more than Justin Trudeau? It's just inexplicable. But there it is, and it really annoys people. And then they go and vote populist, and the elite says, ew, how they're a basket of deplorables. They offend me. They smell. Do not allow them into the house.
He was handed his life on a silver Mercedes, just to be clear. So
he's enjoyed so much. You'd think he'd feel some sense that there's something good about a system in which things like this could happen. Or again, even someone like, Kamala Harris is saying, wow, compared to how America would have treated a person like me 50 or 100 years ago, surely we should be celebrating what a great country this is. But you don't have any sense that she loves America. And if you look back again, you look back at the New Deal, say the Democrats and Republicans sharply divided on all kinds of issues, but they were arguing about which represented the true greatness of America. They were not. And when Trump said, make America great again, the reaction was, America was never great. Well, thank you very much.
Let me ask you about the impact on Canada, because I have some grave concerns. First off, Trump has promised mass deportation of illegal immigrants. Now, there's an estimated 11 million illegal immigrants in the United States. There's no way that he's going to remove all 11 million, but he has said he'll start with the violent criminals and go from there. But sounds like a sane policy to me. If you've let violent criminals just come across your border illegally, maybe you want to get rid of them. But we know, based on, he just threatened to do this last time. And in 2017, we started seeing an influx of people coming across at Roxham Road. The Trudeau government did nothing. At one point, we had 39,000 people coming across at Roxham Road. The Trudeau government did nothing until the Biden administration kind of forced their hand. We now have 44,000 people coming into our airports so far this year and declaring asylum. I don't have any hope that, despite the assurances of Mark Miller this week, despite the assurances of Chrystia Freeland this week, I don't have any hope that the Trudeau government will deal with this if we see a giant surge in people walking across the border again and declaring asylum from America. I don't think they'll do anything other than use it for political gain.
Yes, because ideas have consequences, and their view from Donald Trump is a fascist to so-called Canada is an illegitimate settler colonial state. They don't think that we have any right to control our borders. They have no intention of trying to control our borders. And they think the kind of people Donald Trump wants out of America are probably precisely the kind of people we want in Canada. And this is a classic revolt of the elites kind of situation. When you start every public event with an acknowledgement that we're on stolen land, then you're not liable to take a robust approach to preventing someone else from coming and stealing it from us. It's it starts with bad ideas, and it translates down to bad policies. Or in the case of the Trudeau administration, also they have shown themselves singularly inept when they do try and do something. So even if they attempted to get a handle on it, I don't think they'd succeed. I mean, you always think to yourself, well, somewhere in the RCMP and the security apparatus, there are a bunch of frustrated adults just waiting for permission to do their jobs the way they're meant to. But increasingly, nobody is capable of minding the store. The bigger the bureaucracy gets, the more incompetent it gets. So that is one of those situations in which Trump is liable to hand us a policy problem that we won't even try to solve. And if we did try, we'd mangle it. And more generally,
we've seen Trudeau already mangle immigration in this country. We've gone from a country that, broadly speaking, was fine with high levels of immigration. And he said, oh, you think those are high? Let me really ramp them up, to the point where even he admitted we're bringing in people faster than we can absorb them. Adds to the healthcare crisis, adds to the housing crisis. It's being seen by many economists as a wage reducing move, like a wage suppression move by the Trudeau government, and they still haven't fixed it. They've talked
and of
about
course,
it.
This is a classic example. People think capitalism is right wing, but the big companies are happy to have cheap labor. It's extraordinary if you get out of your ivory tower and go out and deal with people who are making coffee and, staffing hotels and so on. It seems like you deal with nothing but temporary foreign workers. So never mind the corporations being the right-wing force for good or evil. But also, if you let in too many people who don't share our values, your society disintegrates. Again, you look at all these pro-Hamas rallies in the streets of our major cities. You think these are the grandchildren of people who came to Canada gratefully after the Second World War? No, these are the recent arrivals from places where Jew hate is just on the breakfast cereal. And it should have been foreseeable.
It's also people who were born and raised here who were just crazy anti-Semites of the far left.
There certainly is some of that, but the foot soldiers of this, by and large, are recent immigrants who are just, again, the blood libel to them is taken for granted, and nobody in authority and academia and so on seem to think that this would be a problem, because they think that it's Western civilization that is the root of all evil. So again, it comes back to ideas, and part of Trump's appeal is that he doesn't think that. And Kamala Harris probably did. There are going to be other ways in which Trump is a problem for Canada. I mean, he represents a half-wholesome capacity in the American political system. When they get too extended abroad, you do get isolationist movements in politics that are going to retrench, and Trump is not going to be the world's policeman. And of course, we are exposed in that we spend such a pitiful amount on defense because we don't think Canada's worth defending. On the other hand, the Americans can't neglect North American security, so we'll get some protection. But Trump Trump is also inclined to tariffs. We'll have to see what Republicans in Congress want to do. But the other point, which I'm sure you were working your way around to, is that Trudeau has been so rude about Trump that it's going to be a little bit hard to make nice with him now. Of course, Trump isn't polite either. And if I was prime minister, the things I'd have said about Trump, the phone would melt if he tried to talk to me. But at the same time, as prime minister, you're meant to be able to get along, especially with the leaders of our allies, even if they're not your favorite people in this world. And Trudeau is just, again, he has none of the skills that are needed for a leader. And so it's not going to go well.
Let me show or play you for you what I think is going to be part of the problem. Trudeau using MAGA to attack his political opponent in this country, Pierre Poilievre.
It has become glaringly obvious to everyone, except for certain MAGA conservatives, that the fight against climate change is a fight for the future. Ideologically driven MAGA conservatives are calling for pollution to be free again. Unlike these MAGA conservatives, that there is no choice anymore between protecting the environment. He chose to play partisan games last week in trying to shut down this House through a MAGA-inspired approach. There is no debate around support in Ukraine in Canada like there is in other countries where MAGA-inspired far-right movements are undermining supports for Ukraine.
So, John, there's countless examples of Trudeau using MAGA as a slur. There are liberal fundraising emails, social media videos attacking Donald Trump, saying he's unelectable, and that's what Pierre Poilievre is. So how do you work with him? I mean, I was writing columns a year ago telling the Trudeau Liberals, you need to stop this. This guy could win. And I had people scoff, Donald Trump will never be president again. Here we are. Now we're in trouble as we head towards renegotiating NAFTA yet again.
On the other hand, Trump has probably used liberal as an insult quite freely. So to some extent, you ought to be able to laugh it off and say, well, it's possible that neither of us would have voted for the other. But now that we find ourselves as respectively as leaders of our executive branches, we'll get along because we're going to put the national interest first. But we've seen with Trudeau, for instance, when the Freedom Convoy was coming to Ottawa, that he doesn't have that capacity to reach out. He doesn't have a sense of humor about himself. He doesn't have perspective on himself. He's not the kind of guy who can smooth it over with a self-deprecating joke. I remember when George Bush Jr. came up here and he talked about the crowds, and it was so nice that they were waving and using all five fingers. That was
I was in the room for that. That was funny.
Defusing the fact, it's a bit of a cliched line actually, but it defused the fact that a lot of Canadians didn't care for his style or his policies, and recognizing there was in Bush Jr. a certain degree of genuine humility, which of course Trump possesses about as much of as Trudeau, so it's going to be a bit awkward. But you also just have to recognize the United States is bigger than us, and they actually spend on their military, not enough, but way more than we do. So you need to have a certain amount of geopolitical common sense and just a certain amount of human warmth. Again, the thing about Reagan, though, many people despised Reagan until they met him, but it was hard to despise Reagan once he was in the room. I mean, a classic Reagan story, he famously had jelly beans in a cabinet meeting, and if the conversation got tense, he'd pass them around because he thought it was hard to be really surly while eating jelly beans. And that was a profound insight, looking like complete corn. But you can't imagine Justin Trudeau having these kind of little effective tension diffusing. And imagine you're the president of the United States. You got one finger on the button and the other 9 on a bowl of jelly beans. But to Reagan, that was fine. He wasn't. But Trudeau's not like that.
Economically, I think we could be in trouble. And this won't matter about the relationship between Trump and Trudeau. But I think that Trump will unleash the American economy again. He's already said he's going to lift the ban on exporting LNG to Asian countries that Biden put in. The American oil and gas sector is already booming compared to Canada's. He's going to, make that happen to an even larger degree. And the investment that we might be getting in our oil and gas sector is going to move south, because what's our government doing? They're bringing in an emissions cap, which the industry and the province of Alberta and the province of Saskatchewan say amounts to a production cap. So Trudeau is making it more difficult to do business, and Trump is going to make it easier to do business. They are going to flourish And we're going to be hamstrung. By the way, one last point before I let you react to that. There was just a report from StatsCan showing that there's only 2 growth areas of significance in the Canadian economy lately: the oil and gas sector and the public sector. One pays for the other.
Yes, and again, Justin Trudeau and the people around him have no grasp of economics whatsoever. It's sort of a point of pride in the Canadian political system. The old story about Joe Clark having an opportunity to study either French or economics, but not time to do both, and he thought that he would study French to further his ambitions, rather than actually trying to figure out how the world works. But Donald Trump has an instinctive sympathy with the people who actually make stuff, and Trudeau doesn't have any of that. And our economy is more dependent on oil and gas than the American economy. But we're both, at least they are, and we could be an energy superpower. But they've got a lot more diversity in their economy even than we do, though we have a pretty diverse economy. It is critical. But you can't do it because the Trudeau administration are true believers on climate change. They really honestly think all the things they say about, the weather's getting worse and the sky's going to burst into flames and everything will die. And they also think if we stop it, the world will follow us. This obsession they have with that everybody's looking to Canada to see what to do next, and nobody's looking to Canada to see what to do next.
We're the only major oil and gas producing nation in the world that has put in an emissions cap on the industry, and they're bragging about that. And meanwhile, the Americans have been lowering their emissions while increasing oil and gas production, and they don't have a carbon tax, and they don't have the crazy regulations that we do. We have a carbon tax. We have crazy regulations. We have the clean fuel standard. We have the incoming emissions cap. On and on it goes. Our emissions have either been stable or going up during Trudeau's time in office, and the Americans have been able to drop theirs. So your policies clearly aren't working except to kill off the economy that helps pay for your largesse.
Yes, and our liberals, like the Democrats in the United States, both many of them from personal experience, but also as a matter of conviction, think that wealth just generates itself. It just falls from the sky. Freeland's always saying, Chrystia Freeland, we can't afford not to spend more money. You look at the huge increase in the public sector, and even Pierre Poilievre's not talking about getting it back to where it was in 2015. Somehow or other, it'll pay for itself. You don't need that grubby production, that sticky, messy oil. All you need is a whole bunch of people trading memos about DEI. And this is one of the things that cost the Democrats the election, is this feeling that their people were going to come out okay because they're at the public trough no matter what happens. But the average working stiff is in a heap of trouble. And here in Canada, too, you think of the kind of people Trudeau knows who are all working for the government. And he doesn't grasp that you need somebody to pay the bills. We could just print the money, quantitative easing of all those terrible ideas that a long name didn't make better. And so we are governed by people who have no idea where wealth comes from, and we let them govern us. Again, it's the picture of Dorian Voter. They didn't fall from the sky. We elected them. But it's also, I think, the fault to some extent of conservatives who aren't willing to stand up to all of this. Including even you mentioned, American emissions are falling. Well, unless carbon dioxide is pollution, who cares if emissions are falling? What's that got to do with anything? But no Canadian politician, plenty of American politicians, Republicans, virtually to a man or a woman, have challenged the notion that there's a man-made climate crisis. Try and get Pierre Poilievre to say there is no man-made climate crisis. Try and get Danielle Smith to say it. None of them have the guts to say it. And that's why I think our country's in danger of building up more pressure to a bigger populist explosion, because our political class, it's a strange thing to say, if only we had people like Donald Trump, but we need somebody who's willing to articulate the things that most normal people understand, like that the weather's not getting worse. One of the reasons there were no climate voters in the United States worth mentioning is that the average American knows it's not true that the weather's getting worse. It's just bad because it's always been bad. And I think most Canadians know that, but try and find one politician who will say, you know what, the weather's not getting worse. That's just a complete misunderstanding, misrepresentation. They should go look at the records. We need more politicians who are willing to stand up for common sense in a decent way before, again, as the Americans did, you get someone standing up for it in a way that's not that decent. And the more we damage ourselves in policy and bounce off Donald Trump and all this kind of stuff, the more likely it is that we're going to have this famous backlash. So for heaven's sakes, why not be sensible before you're cornered? Why is that so hard?
Well, we've just got a couple minutes left, so let's talk about Trump and the impact on the world. Of course, lots of people pulling their hair out over this. what his position will be with Israel, what his position will be with Ukraine, with China and Taiwan. It was interesting. I was at a talk by Barry Weiss of the Free Press, a very intelligent, impressive woman, and she was asked about Harris and Trump, and she said, "My fear is that one candidate doesn't want Israel to win, that's Harris, and the other candidate doesn't want Ukraine to win, and that's Trump." I can see some sense in that. There's a lot of pressure on the Republican side just to get a deal, but I have the sense that Trump will be able to get a deal that doesn't see Ukraine give up territory. But then again, I could be wrong on that. I don't see Trump's election leading to utter chaos in the world because he was president for 4 years and those predictions didn't come true.
And one reason why is that Trump is somewhat unpredictable and he's somewhat touchy. And so if you pick on one of America's friends, you might find that Trump, despite the various things that he said, gets into high dudgeon and does something about it. And the Ukraine issue is an interesting one because I know people on the right in this country too who are against supporting Ukraine because they're so disgusted with the elite on every issue, including COVID, that they don't believe it even when it's right, as it is on Ukraine. On the other hand, the elite is kind of anti-Israel, so Donald Trump is pro-Israel. But I do think if China were to invade Taiwan, Trump would not say, never mind, let him have it. That's not the kind of person he is. Whereas Kamala Harris, so somebody said about George McGovern that, you know, if Israel were attacked and on the verge of extinction, he would wring his hands and send a field hospital. That Kamala Harris might well have failed to respond having made commitments, and Donald Trump might well respond despite not having made them. If he's capable of complete irresponsibility and he doesn't really know the issues, I hope that he will go to Putin with a deal on Ukraine that is not unreasonable, and then when Putin turns it down, he will back Ukraine better than Biden did. But I may be guilty of wishful thinking. I am sure he'll stand with Israel, and this is the critical conflict of our time. And so if you're going to be right on one and wrong on one, be right on Israel. I don't see why you can't be right on both, but if you got to pick one, be right on Israel. And the Democratic Party was wrong on Israel and kept calling for a ceasefire and saying, let Hamas have free hits on Jews. Trump isn't like that. So even geopolitically, I think on balance, he's better than Kamala Harris, though that's clearing a low bar.
There's one easy way for America to stop sending billions to Ukraine, but still fund them so that they can win the war, and that's to hand over all of Putin's assets that they've seized. There is a way to do that, even staying within the confines of what is loosely known as international law. They've frozen these assets. They can hand them over to Zelensky and say, here you go, spend your boy's money attacking him or defending against him.
Yeah, there's exactly the sort of thing Biden wouldn't do because of that appeasement-minded elite that has dominated Western politics. Is one of the things that drives normal people crazy because they figure if someone starts a fight with you, you should fight back. What Ukraine really needs is artillery shells, right? It's fine if they can spend the money, but they've got to be able to buy shells. We have learned in this war that it's still the 20th century on a battlefield in many ways. And again, Canada needs to start ramping up its artillery production, and even the Americans are doing it. Everybody needs a lot more shells as the world gets uglier. So yes, give them the money, but give them the munitions. And Trump may, especially if Putin annoys him, he might say, we'll show you now. There's more hope with him, but that one's a file that I'm anxious on.
Yeah, and on the Israel side, he's already shown that he was willing to deal with Iran, and he was right on Iran 8 years ago. Biden was wrong on Iran when he came in and lifted sanctions and released funding.
That Obama was catastrophically wrong.
That funding went directly to Hamas and Hezbollah.
As any fool could have seen, right? Again, the clevers, one of the problems with the clevers is they thought themselves into a degree of stupidity. So Orwell said you have to belong to the intelligentsia to believe stuff like that. No ordinary person could be such a fool. And we have seen the revenge of the ordinary person in the United States. And we need it in Canada. Again, let's try and channel it in a bit more dignified and thoughtful way. But it's a shock to the whole world to say the elites who've been misrunning things can't just keep doing it. And that may be salutary in Canada as well. We may all come out of this better off than you'd think when you said the words, Donald Trump was just elected president of the United States again.
John Robson, thanks so much.
A pleasure as always.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Remember, you can subscribe to Full Comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Podcast. Listen to us through the app or Alexa-enabled devices. Help us out as well. Leave a rating, give us a review, tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.